Good evening. Tonight we start with something different. Not the sound of ire, nor the crack of a whip, but a quieter, more powerful tool. The planned theft of sleep, used by rulers and questioners for ages. Forget what you see in movies. There are no dramatic tools or clear wounds here. Only a slow steady breaking of the mind, while the body seems fine. Truth is, if you were put in that routine now, you likely would not make it a day. If you are enjoying this, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I am always amazed by all the places people watch from. Silence your alerts, take a deep breath and let's begin. The first signs are subtle, like a face in a dream you can't quite recall, but they are there if you look. Laws about night watches, old palace records that detail nightly duties. Rituals that ask the faithful to stay awake until morning. In Assyria and Babylon, there are orders about staying awake. Rules to keep watch, fines for failing to do so. A system that insisted someone must be awake to see danger and report it. Hammurabi's laws from long ago do not call sleepslins a punishment, but they show how much value was placed on being awake. A guard who sleeps on duty causes damage and invites chaos. The law punishes neglect, making wakefulness a public duty. Staying awake was an old public need, as old as cities themselves. It was necessary, enforced and respected by authority. To be forced to stay awake was first a civic duty. City walls and stores needed eyes, and eyes must stay open. This civic need easily became a tool for punishment. A fine for a sleeping watchman is not torture yet. It is a practical order backed by city leaders. But once the system of watches, tortures, chains and beatings exists, they can be turned to other uses. The same chains that stop a thief can also stop someone from sleeping. The tools were simple, more light for walking in yards. Chains that made rest hard guards who shouted and poked. They demanded sleep in exchange for cooperation. Quiet pressure rested on everyday administration. Rituals took the need to stay awakened, gave it meaning. Across ancient lands there were required night watches, forms of prayer where staying awake became a spiritual. Babylonian festivals, vigils for the dead, Israelite watches for divine signs. All demanded long nights. Worry about signs and God's favor made sleepslins an act of faith. Faith then became discipline. He who could last the night proved himself to gods and men. That same idea could be used against enemies. To be kept awake under guard could be shown as a kind of holy test. The accused is held in the city's light, denied the comfort of night, seen as a soul awaiting judgment. Ancient medical and philosophical texts gave words for both faith and punishment. Early doctors saw sleep as a natural balance. The body needed a certain rhythm. Too much or too little sleep affected health and mood. Doctors knew that losing sleep wore the body thin. Nerves frayed, judgment faded. This knowledge made sleep loss useful to those wanting confessions. A tired mind is more flexible, more open to suggestion, easier to lead to a confession. State power and medical thought grew together. Sleepslins could be seen as illness, as divine punishment, or as proof of guilt. This overlap allowed forms of control that were hands-off but personal. No knife, no scar, just the slow grind of being kept awake. Old writers provide the details. Historians note forced wakefulness among soldiers and guards. Greek writers tell of mercenaries who had to keep watch in hostile land. They note the discipline needed, and how exhaustion breaks unity. Roman records tell of guards executed for sleeping on duty. Tacitus describes Roman questioning, where night watches and long talks merged. The Roman military code was harsh on sleep during watch. Punishment could be death or severe injury. Brutal, efficient, and useful for commanders who wanted to deter others, but the practice also appears in less violent places. Athenian courts, temples, even family disputes. People could be made to endure the night question at dawn, denied rest. Stories of tyrants keeping rivals awake with music, or judges demanding oaths after sleepless nights. These make sense when you see how thin the line was between public order, ritual, and punishment in ancient cities. What is punishment for one is discipline for another. The result is that being awake in ancient times was a loaded state, partly a virtue, partly a weakness. Archaeology shows us the physical side of this history. Watches on walls, guard posts, on roads, small cells under palaces. These remind us that long nights were shaped by buildings as much as laws. Small cells with stone floors and little light were not made for comfort. They were made to reduce sleep. A sleeping body needs warmth, a flat space, a place to curl. Remove these and you remove the chance of restful sleep. A cell bright at night, replaced where footsteps pass constantly, is a room that creates wakefulness. The physical tools, iron rings on walls, chains that prevent lying down, torches that burn with harsh light. These were as important as law books. If you wanted people awake, you built a place to keep them awake. By late ancient times and into the medieval period, the tactic moved. Institutions changed form, but not their goal. As cities changed, new powers rose. Control over bodies moved to bishops, monasteries, feudal courts. But the demand for information and confession remained. Early inquisitions were not yet the horror of later times, but they created spaces where all-night questioning could happen. Heretics, which is political suspect, faced continuous questioning by church officials. They watched for demons, but also valued the spectacle of confession. The monk's own culture of night prayer was a ready model for forced wakefulness. Keep watch to keep the soul pure, or keep watch to break the soul's resistance. The imagery easily turned to coercion. Medieval European law was full of contradictions. Church law and Roman tradition insisted on some protections, but feudal rights and fear of heresy allowed extreme measures. Records and church rolls show questioning schedules, lists of witnesses, notes on nights in custody. The bureaucratic drive of medieval officers made many papers. These papers both enabled and hid coercion. Questioners wrote what they wanted to remember and left out what might cause trouble. Many victims of forced confession are unknown to us, because an official wrote his methods proudly, not because the victim could tell their story. Literacy helped the one in power. Ships and prisons became testing grounds. The closed world of the ship developed ways to keep bodies useful. A sailor asleep at the wheel risked every life. Naval law was clear, punishment was public and harsh. Over time, less visibly violent forms of discipline grew. Pure force was replaced by routines of forced wakefulness. Forced watches, hammocks that allowed no comfort, chains that made lying down impossible. Naval courts are full of cases where sleeping on watch was a moral failure fixed by pain. The late 1700 seconds and early 1800 seconds saw a gap between talk of reform and reality at sea. Reformers argued for better conditions, while men below deck faced routines meant to remove slackness. The early modern period added more records and bureaucracy. This both allowed and hid sleep-based coercion. Inquisition manuals from Spain and Italy gave step-by-step guides for questioning. The famous witch-hunting text of 1487 spread a logic of suspicion. It justified long scrutiny of accused witches. Its warm words about procedure hid the cold practice of night questioning. Nights of relentless questions, repeated leading questions, use of shame and exhaustion. These were often not called torture. They were filed as necessary steps. Judicial violence changed shape, but not effect. The rack, the pillory, public beatings left visible marks, easy to condemn or cheer. Sleep denial worked in the invisible realm. A confession at dawn could be written as voluntary, blessed by a notary's seal and witness statements. No one might note the accused had been awake for 2 days. The record becomes a palimpsest. The paper says yes, the flesh remembers false. Historians in archives learn to read silence as much as ink. A missing line in a ledger, a sudden stop, impaired to neat morning confession. These are clues that a night was very long. Across Europe and its growing empires, policing developed quieter tools next to the sword. Town watch systems became early police. By the 1600 seconds and 1700 seconds groups that would become modern police tried sober, persistent methods. In early London, houses of correction aimed to reform through labour and discipline. The watchhouse became a place where a person's daily rhythm could be reshaped. The pru, the wanderer, the dissident. Each could be taught to be still by day, and restless at night as punishment. The goal was changing behavior more than payback. The method was steady pressure, light noise guard shifts required roles, denial of arrest. In colonies the stage widened and stakes grew higher. European empires moved the security systems across the world. They adapted old methods to new lands. In colonies from India to Algeria, Jamaica to Kenya, imperial powers faced rebellion, banditry, political movements. Traditional policing did not work well. The logic of sleep denial, its efficiency, deniability, and mental impact made it attractive. It left no clear scar on the body. An inquiry could be called keeping order. It offered a way to get information without open courts or fair process. The French in Algeria show an early stark example. During the harsh war from 1954 to 1962, French military units used a range of pacification tactics. Questioning included long night sessions, loss of rest, sensory disruption. This kept detainees awake and confused. Testimony after independence and later admissions by French officers reveals sleep loss was part of a set of methods. The logic was simple: take away sleep and a person becomes more moldable. Where public opinion and law and obvious mutilation, the quiet weapon was used. It was also easier to justify to soldiers told this was cleaning house for security. British imperial policing learned similar lessons, sometimes from its own experience, sometimes from others. Colonial police in India from the late 1800s developed methods of long questioning under tension. These included systematic disruption of sleep. Reports from Indian reformers and nationalist leaders tell of nights of questioning. Family kept in separate cells, the accused brought for questioning at odd hours to prevent sleep. The logic of punitive sleepslins fit with broader preventive detention laws and emergency powers. This characterized British rule in much of the region. Gandhi and others wrote of police methods, less visibly violent, but deeply demeaning. Noise movement and the removal of time. The Momo emergency in Kenya from 1950 to 1960 is a telling case of scale and hiding. The colonial response to rebellion involved mass detention, a camp network and repressive methods, aimed at breaking networks and morale. For many detainees, sleep loss through loud work, forced night questioning, and daily routines that minimized rest became normal. Records came out slowly, partly because paperwork was spotty, partly because the regime built a legal and word shield. Detainees were held for rehabilitation or punishment. Their schedules were called labor for the common good. It took decades for archives to open and survivor testimony to be heard. In the 2000s, British courts and historians first opened files showing systematic abuse. For years, archive silence served the empire. French and British colonial practice met at a crossroads of scientific reason. Officials sought to justify harsh measures as modern governance, where experts spoke of civilizing missions, control systems used non-spectacular violence to shape behavior. The claim was always that methods were restorative or preventive, that they kept order for the greater good. Sleep loss fit this story, a temporary discomfort for long-term stability. The irony was not lost on those who suffered it. Many colonial officials and private letters admitted the moral gray area, even while calling it necessary. The dark joke of empire was it claimed to be modern and humane, while perfecting techniques that left no visible wounds. The trouble of documenting such practices is built in. Scarred flesh can be photographed and examined. Days spent awake are harder to prove. Colonized peoples who struggled to match colonial paperwork found their complaints turned into a language that favored physical proof. A colonial court would ask for evidence. The evidence that mattered, Kai's bruises, cuts, was missing. Testimony that a man was kept awake for nights, questioned, repeatedly moved between cells, was often called hearsay or the grumbling of a troubled memory. This imbalance helped keep practices alive. Their strategic benefits included believable denial. The administration could say, "We did not torture." The lack of scars made that claim seem plausible. Another legal shield protected sleep-based coercion. The use of words that make deprivation seem normal. Terms like protective custody, preventive detention, rehab schedule, let officials wrap routines of denial in administrative respect. Detainees were labeled dangerous or at risk, thus stripped of rights that would demand independent watch. Also, the mix of military and civil authority let commanders call sleep loss an operational need. This made judges back home reluctant to step in without solid proof. The result was a culture of silence where the quiet weapon thrived. Scale was a practical concern. Using sleep disruption on many people needs organization. Shifts of guard spaces designed to prevent sleep standard question timetables. The ability to move detainees often. It is not a one-person job, it is institutional. When colonial administrations faced mass resistance, the temptation was to scale up techniques that could be used widely and cheaply. Keeping noisy camp work roll calls at odd hours, denying comfortable bedding. These were cheap in budget terms, devastating in human terms. The logistics were simple and grimly efficient. Exhaustion does not need a steady supply of weapons. It needs people who keep hours in the will to keep someone awake. There were moments when these practices were challenged, sometimes with success. International human rights groups, missionary societies, later free governments, used reports, legal pressure, public testimony to force open record, to insist the invisible be named. The French state, after the Algerian War, faced officers' admissions that methods like sleep disruption were used systematically. Some officers were court-martialed, some fled into political protection. Some, like Paul A. Useresses, publicly defended what they did for years. His frankness in memoirs and 2000 seconds interviews forced a national reckoning, reluctant and partial. The British government faced slow, embarrassing exposure. Declassified cables, survivor testimony, decades later lawsuits about colonial-era abuse. As a McKenyan detention case, these cases show a pattern. The longer a practice is defended as routine administration, the harder it is to remove. But the more persistent the testimony and the sharper the archive search, the more likely the quiet weapon will be named. What stands out across these eras, ancient, medieval, early, modern, colonial, is how sleep deprivation works as a weapon where knowledge and power meet. It is a method that uses what we know about human biology and thinking. It uses institution routines and building features. It relies on the record keeper's control of the story. It scales because it is cheap in material terms and devastating in mental terms. It is quiet because it leaves little to photograph and much to doubt. Its effectiveness has always depended on the broader legitimacy of the institution using it, a city, a church, an avia colonial administration. When the users are seen as legitimate, or as having the right to use extreme measures, the quiet weapon slips into practice. When they are not, its use becomes a scandal. Its defenders must scramble for justifying words. And yet, even as empires and courts change, the basic math does not. The watch becomes a means of surveillance. The cell becomes a place where nights are engineered. The jailer becomes a technician of sleepslessness. The moral language shifts. Religious watchfulness becomes administrative need. Legal terms become euphemisms, but the social effect lasts. Sleep, the most private human comfort, becomes a site of state power. The weapon is elegant in its cruelty because it is efficient and deniable. It is the bureaucrat's favorite, till inexpensive, scalable, and embarrassingly effective. One can trace the arc from ancient civic duty to colonial counter-rebellion as a story of institutional learning. Each later power learned how to use wakefulness as control by borrowing and refining the tools at hand. The Assyrian watchman's torch becomes the medieval inquisitor's lamp, which becomes the colonial jailer's floodlight. Techniques like forced standing, forced march, schedules, irregular questioning recur because they meet the same goals. Those goals are unromantic stability and information. Sleep denial is a way to get them without the cost of public spectacle. That is not to say it is free. It takes a toll in human dignity and in the long sediment of trauma. that outlives empire and procedure. Small ironies fill the story. Those who wrote high theory about human nature, philosophers and doctors, often unknowingly gave the reason for coercion. If humoral theory said the mind could be unbalanced by wakefulness, then wakefulness itself became a probe test for guilt or temperament. If ritual vigil proved devotion, then forced vigil could be reframed as a test of sincerity. In this, the words of the learned and the practice of the powerful worked together. The quiet weapon is thus also an intellectual artifact. It is set not only in brick and drope, but in ideas about proof, confession, and the body's pliability. There are sharp, bitter small stories along the way that make the point like a dark joke. A colonial magistrate scribbles a note subject brought in morning session, confesses no more detail. A sailor blamed for a missed watch is publicly whipped and shows open shame all can see. Another man is gently broken at dawn, accused of complicity, shattered by repetition and exhaustion. The first paints a dramatic moral tale, the second is an administrative truth. If there is dark humor, it's in the bureaucrat's satisfaction. The state invented a means of compliance that is effective, affordable, and keeps its hands seemingly clean. It is the sort of efficiency that in another setting would be praised in management guides. It is also worth noting traditions of resistance and adaptation. People subjected to forced wakefulness found strategies. Shared watches that spread the burden, faked sleep to save energy. Physical moves to catch minutes of rest even in the worst cells. Prisoners and detainees shared knowledge about coping in harsh conditions. Song stories, quiet passing of time were survival techniques. These small acts of resistance rarely made it into official archives. They live in oral history, in memoirs, in the rough reports of activists and clergy who helped prisoners. The persistence of testimony voices that insist on telling the night experience becomes a main way the quiet weapon is exposed. If scars are absent, words can be weapons. By the mid-20th century, international law began to catch up, at least in words, with the problem. The Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, later the UN Convention Against Torture, recognized in various ways that methods that harm human dignity and resistance are wrong. The language, however, lagged behind practice. Definitions of torture have long been fought over. The line between inhuman treatment and torture itself is contested. The 5 techniques used by British forces in Northern Ireland in 1971, wall standing, hooding, noise, deprivation of sleep and food, led to a famous European Court of Human Rights decision in 1978. They called them inhuman and degrading, but not torture, a distinction that has haunted lawsuits and moral judgment since. The legal fine print matters because for governments the classification decides legal results. If a method is not classed as torture, it can be defended as necessary pressure. Colonial histories pushed this legal change forward in a sad way. Practices refined in colonies methods of questioning the practicals of detention. Bureaucratic soft words were sometimes brought back to the home country, or used in other areas of state violence, that the colonizer could be taught by the colonized, and the dark arts of coercion is a bitter twist. Empires sent out both the machinery of rule and the repression techniques it found useful abroad. The long 20th century then saw the global spread of methods that began partly in colonial policing. Late 20th century counter-rebellion manuals, for all their clinical language, often bore the clear mark of that history. When you step back from detail and see the pattern, you see a phenomenon stubbornly modern in effect, if not origin. Sleep deprivation as a tool thrives where institutions have power to structure time and space, and to claim moral or legal authority for their actions. It is cheap in resource terms, adaptable to different cultural logics, and resilient under scrutiny because it lacks visible violence. The historian's task is to make the invisible visible, to read the administrative forms, to listen for absences in the record, to follow testimony through courts and into declassified files. The storyteller's task is simpler and darker. to hold the alertness of the past up to the night of the present, and to remind a listener that the oldest weapons are sometimes the lightest and quietest. There is a final irony, the sleepless historian notes with a sad smile. Empires tell stories of their power in public shows, triumphal arches, brave regiments. They prefer visible monuments because visibility turns coercion into spectacle that can be justified. Yet some of the most effective technologies of control are intimate, ordinary and undeniable. They do not need monuments. They need torches, lists, shifts, and the patient management of hours. They need the ability to make time itself a tool. That is why the history of sleep deprivation as a weapon is not just a list of methods. It is an anatomy of rule and a study in how power learns to shape the human day. It is the story of how state, ancient city-states and modern empires, turn the ordinary need for rest into an instrument of control. We carry this legacy forward because the conditions that make sleep deprivation practical remain. Institutions able to detain bureaucracies, able to use soft words, legal frames that sometimes prefer order to justice. The challenge for historians, activists, and law people is to insist on translation of evidence, to show not only that a confession exists but the hours and practices that made it, to link the absence of scars with the presence of coercive scheduling, to treat patterns of night and day as political acts. The quiet weapon thrives under the cover of routine. Expose the routine and its elegance begins to look like mere administration. The scene changes but the tactic stays. So the story that starts in the stone courts of Hammurabi wanders through candle-lit inquisitor rooms and the decks of 17th century warships and returns in the holsters of mid-20th century imperial police, is consistent in one bleak myth. Makes someone awakened, you make them readable. The body gives up things more easily when it does not sleep. That column of institutional knowledge has been built patiently over millennia, brick upon brick, watch after watch. The human cost is written not in scarred issue, but in the long history survivors carried in records that took generations to pry open. There is humor in the bureaucrat's delight. There is sorrow in the historian's duty to tell it. And there is finally a moral urgency to remember, to guard against the institutional seduction that believes a quiet weapon, because it leaves no marks, leaves no guilt. It does, it always has. The brain sleeps like a city at night. Lights dim, the machines of daily urgency, slow streets empty of urgent traffic. Maintenance crews come out to work. Sleep is not one thing but a choreography of state siege with a purpose. In early hours of non-dream sleep the mind drops into deep slow waves. Clinicians call this slow wave sleep. Neurons fall into a synchronized rhythm. The brain seems to pull blankets over the day's excitements. Later in the flickering theater of dream sleep, eyes art under closed lids. The body goes limp, the mind rehearses, integrates, sometimes hallucinates. It stitches emotions and memories into the thin fabric that will hold the self together the next day. Between these bookends are lighter stages, where the sleeping mind practices attention, strengthens habits, prunes unneeded links, and rehearses tomorrow's small decisions. Listen to that city analogy far into the night and you can hear other things, river channels of spinal fluid widening their course, the brain's cleaning system washing synaptic alleyways free of metabolic waste. The hippocampus, a temporary store, passes precious items, memories, into the long-term vault of the cortex. Sleep is housekeeping, waste clearance, synaptic recalibration, emotional editing. It lifts the sediment of the day, lets the mind see more clearly in the morning, less brittle, less prone to flaring at small insults. That clarity, it turns out, is fragile, interrupts sleep, and everything in that dark maintenance begins to fray. Take away the slow waves and the brain cannot consolidate memories, names, places, facts. The transfer from short-term to long-term storage is short-circuited. Remove dream sleep and the emotional residue of experience stays unprocessed. The thicket of fear, shame, grief, or rage does not get the gentle pruning that makes it manageable. The prefrontal cortex, the command post that checks and plans complex decisions, is especially sensitive to sleep loss. With even one night of major disruption, People make poorer judgments, become less flexible, lose the capacity for sustained attention. Their plans turn brittle, their reasoning becomes local and immediate, not strategic. The amygdala, the old threat detector, becomes more excitable. Sleep loss amplifies its voice, turns molehills into mountains. Emotion becomes loud and nuance is muffled. There is a biochemical currency to this vulnerability. Adenosine builds in the brain as hours awake. Had up a gentle push toward sleep. Interrupt the night repeatedly, and adenosine message gets confused. Circadian rhythms lose sync with the world. Cortisol rhythms jump like a badly tuned metronome. The stress axis stays in a state of low steady alarm. With that background hum of emergency decision-making falters, willpower wears thin. The ability to sustain resistance, be it a refusal, a subtle lie, or a stubborn silence, wears away. The neuroscience, in short, puts sleep squarely at the line between coherence and falling apart. Psychologically, sleep loss increases suggestibility and damages personal memory. Recall becomes state-dependent in a way questioners have long understood in the abstract. When the state of a mind is changed, so too are the cues that call memories forth. A person who cannot sleep may still have memories intact in some physiological sense, but the threads that allow retrieval, context, associative pathways, the quiet intact scaffolding of executive function are frayed. Add emotional overreaction and reduced mental endurance, and you produce a mind more likely to make errors, confuse events, take back statements, or accept ideas that would seem nonsense in full awake clarity. None of this needs to be a manual. It is the anatomy of a vulnerability. For those who study coercion, whether in courts or archives, that anatomy explains why sleep is so often in the repertoire of repression. It is cheap, it leaves no clear mark, and it attacks the very scaffolding on which resistance rests. Attention, memory, and emotional control. In the lab, scientists can measure reaction times, see the prefrontal slow down, watch the amygdala flare. In the field, those measures mean a reduced capacity to reason and bear stress. This is why sleep denial has been for so long a method of power, not just an accidental side effect of detention, because it prefers the subtle erosion of agency over open wounding, and because secrecy and deniability are built into its logic. The 20th century is full of regimes that learned this lesson and made it routine. Sometimes in plain sight, more often behind doors that ate paperwork and breathed silence. From the dungeons of early totalitarian states to the modernized camps and secret prisons of the Cold War, authorities turned the vulnerabilities of the sleeping brain into policy and practice. In the Soviet Union, the machinery was bureaucratic, vast, and often murderously efficient. After the revolution, the secret police set the tone. By the 1930s, the NKVD had moved from random terror to a bureaucratic art. Records that surfaced later show a system that favored quotas for arrest, transit prisons that delayed contact and stretched nights into a worn-out blur, questioning centers where suspects were moved from cell to cell until their story was plied. The Great Purge is known for show trials and mass killings, less often noted, but clear in survivor accounts and police memos, are periods of sensory and time dislocation used to force confessions, techniques that did not need a scar to work. In Germany, the Gestapo and SS perfected what they liked to call secrecy with formality. Dossiers category centralized intelligence fed a machine that could find a person, label them an enemy, and move them through cells, questioning rooms, camps. The concentration camp system had its own rituals meant to grind down identity as much as discipline bodies. Roll calls at odd hours, forced work that turned night into day, constant unpredictability that stopped the mind from settling into restorative patterns. Nuremberg trials and post-war testimony list many of you. The common thread was a systemic denial of the small mercies that keep human coherence, consistent sleep chief among them. Colonial wars in the mid-century made sleep loss a tool of counter-rebellion. In Algeria during the Battle of Algiers in 1957, French paratroopers looked for efficient ways to get information from captured rebels. Harsh tactics were used in the name of saving lives at home. A book published in 1958 made public the practices used in Algiers, the language of questioning, the denial of rest, the calculated erosion of hope. Years later, General Paulet Useresses would write bluntly about methods used by French forces, a confession not of accidental excess, but of systematic policy. The public debate that followed showed the gap between public law and the practical tactics of empire. The British experience in Northern Ireland brought the matter into European courts. In the early 1970s, after a policy of imprisonment without trial, British security forces used a set of techniques on detainees, meant to disorient, remove normal sensory anchors and break resistance. The matter reached the European Court of Human Rights in 1978. The court gave a legal judgment that the methods had been inhuman and degrading, but stopped short of calling them torture under the law as it was then framed. The case showed how sleep and island-related techniques could sit in a legal grey area, morally repellent, operationally effective, legally contested. Latin America in the 1970s turned counter-rebellion into an industrial state project. In Argentina, after the 1976 coup, system of secret detention was set up. Secret prisons became processing centers where people were questioned and many never released. A national commission later detailed a machinery of disappearance and torture that included systematic use of sleep disruption, among other techniques. Chile followed a similar path after the 1973 coup. The secret police ran questioning centers where thousands were held. State documents and survivor testimony would later map a pattern of repeated night attacks on detainees. Operation Condor, cross-border repression agreement, united security services from several countries. It turned the practice into a multinational export. Prisoners disappeared across borders, dossiers were swapped, techniques copied. Declassified cables and internal documents show the logic was strategic, not random. Eliminate leaders, terrorize support networks, discredit dissent by forcing false confessions. This pattern, the copying of methods across prisons, secret sites, camps and black sites, the training that moved between services, the soft words that hid intent, speaks to command responsibility. These were not just the dark arts of a few rogue officers. They were often the result of DCT, of framing security manuals, counter-rebellion courses, and internal policy memos that gave permission through silence or direct order. Sometimes top leaders approved the tools openly. More often, they created an environment where efficient neutralization of opponents mattered more than legal fine point. In that environment, techniques that attacked sleep, and with it, the cohesion of identity, could flourish, because they weren't highly deniable, inexpensive, and effective. Survivor testimony runs through the archives like a constant whisper, from Gulag memoirs to Argentine mothers in the Plaza to accounts collected in Chile. These voices document what files sometimes hide the pattern of minute-by-minute breakdown. Archives give numbers and orders, testimony gives texture. The glazed hours, the repeated talks in windowless rooms, the waittime itself was used as a tool to erode confidence and memory. Together they show a pattern that is strategic and scalable. Sleep denial is not a one-time cruelty, but a repeatable part of a repressive toolkit. The Cold War intensified the marriage between coercion, statecraft, and science. The ideological contest pushed spy agencies into new areas, where the language of experiment and the prestige of medicine served as cover for projects that aimed to understand and sometimes weaponize evil vulnerabilities of the human mind. In the United States, worries that began with prisoners in Korea and grew in 1952 anti-communist fear produced a series of programs. Project Artichoke in the early 1952 and the better-known MK Ultra from 1953 were CIA efforts to explore questioning, conditioning, and behavior change, often through drugs, hypnosis, and sensory manipulation. The chemist who ran much of MK Ultra authorized funding, often through fake foundations. for research done in universities and clinics. The most infamous clinical example was the work of Drive-Ewan Cameron in Montreal. His deep attoning experiments combined long drug-induced, sleep-heavy electroshock therapy and repeated tape recordings to create a blank slate. Cameron's patients were often unaware, and the CIA later admitted funding some of his work. The moral cost was huge. Victims and families later sued. Public reveals in the 1970s forced a reckoning with crossed ethical lines. Intelligence manuals coded a paradox. Techniques called non-physical were appealing because they left no visible scars. This let agencies claim they followed public law while getting information through coercion. A declassified CIA interrogation manual from the 1960s discussed psychological pressure in ways that blurred the line between clinical note and coercive practice. Across the Atlantic, allied services watched and shared. The British had their own secret programs and experiments that reflected the same era's interest in conditioning and psychological weakness. Soviet and Eastern Bloc services followed their own path, sometimes parallel, sometimes crossing. The politicization of psychiatry in the USS, are most famous for the diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia, gave a medical gloss to locking up dissidents. Label a critic mentally ill, commit them to a psychiatric hospital, and the state reached to goals neutralizing opposition and masking political detention as therapy. The practice was not only Russian throughout the Eastern Bloc. Psychiatric institutions could become tools of repression. Declassified party files and accounts of dissidents who got their files after 1991 show that psychiatrists and state security worked together in ways that broke the oath to do no harm. And then there was the profession itself pulled into the spy world. Psychologists and psychiatrists were recruited, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, to consult for questioning programs. Some argued that understanding the mind could prevent coercion or help resist it. Others described techniques in ways that, whether meant to or not, made methods of influence seem legitimate. The moral fallout was sharp. Professional groups stating ethical rules. Human subject protection spread, and the idea that medical skill should serve national security without limits was publicly challenged. Revelations that came with U.S. Senate investigations in 1975 and later hearings exposed many secret programs and prompted legal and administrative changes. Institutional review boards grew in hospitals and universities. Clinical practice guidelines were strengthened, and in international law, the post-war human rights framework, already in place since Nuremberg, undetailed in the Universal Declaration and later the UN Convention Against Torture, gained new urgency. Yet the knowledge made in those Cold War years did not vanish neatly into ethics books. It seeped as knowledge does into grey areas and into professional blind spots of later conflict. Manuals once written or copied ideas move. The same logic that made sleep denial attractive to totalitarian police. No scar's great effect made it attractive to spy groups trying to get truth from the fog of war. The moral clarity that came in the 1970s was therefore partial. Laws could be tightened, some careers ruined, some experiments exposed. But the techniques and the temptation to use them when political stakes were high remained. Later decades would show this painfully when new conflicts created new excuses, and old reasons were dusted, often used again. What comes from the Cold War archive is a lesson both practical and regrettable. Science can show vulnerability without teaching virtue. Medicine and psychology can explain how the mind works, but they can also be enlisted to refine methods of control. Spy agencies offer triarians and counter-rebellion schools, all learned to value the math of deniability and efficiency, where sleep could be a lever to shift memory and will it was used, where psychiatry could hide the work of politics it hid it, and when documents were to pried open by committees, courts and the public, the reveals reshaped professional boundaries and international norm, even as the underlying temptation of the weapon that leaves no scars remained a stubborn human device. So the story runs from the brain's tender hours into the furnace of power. Sleep in its quietness is a kind of sovereignty of the self, and the deliberate theft of that sovereignty became through the 20th century a to love statecraft, cheap, deniable, intimate. The science explains why it worked. The archives and testimony show how it was made systematic. The Cold War shows how medicine and spy work braided together to boost abilities and blur duties. The total lesson is not just historical. It is a quiet, insistent, moral warning about the uses of knowledge, about the ease with which techniques meant perhaps to heal or understand can be remade into tools of control when political needs override legal and ethical care. At night, in cells or secret rooms in the hush of state files and the bright light of indictment, the same weakness shown by neuroscience was exploited again and again. Those who collect the records, the archivists, who handle yellow-typed pages, the survivors who turn private pain into public testimony, are the ones who keep watch. They catalogue not for revenge, but to make sure the lesson can be read. To understand why such methods work is not to teach their youth. It is to show how fragile human coherence is, and thus to guard the institutions and norms that protect it. In the end, the Cold War's mix of spy ambition and clinical reason left a legacy that shaped the late 20th century. Governments learned that certain actions could produce results without visible ruin. They also learned that secrecy could be broken and that legal and professional norms could be reasserted. The rest is an uneasy balance. Knowledge that can be used for care or for harm, and social frames that must decide which it will be. The great archives, the courtroom transcripts, the survivors' papers. These are the traces we follow, the dim lights showing how sleep, that most ordinary human need, became in modern history both a refuge and a battleground. In the quiet, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, a worried machinery of policy, law and improvisation began to turn in rooms hard to find on any map. Washington offices, some formal, many makeshift, filled with people who spoke in memos, in classified briefings, and late-night calls. They traded phrases like vital intelligence, preventing the next attack, and the softer euphemism that would define an era, enhanced interrogation. Sleep, its absence, its manipulation, its use as a tool slid easily into the bureaucratic language, not as an afterthought, not as an accidental symptom, but as a deliberate instrument. The first public hints of sleep, used as a weapon in the war on terror, came in early 2002, as detainees caught in Afghanistan and Pakistan were moved into a shadowy detention system. The most infamous of these prisoners, Abu Zhu, by the caught in March 2002, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, caught in March 2003, are names now taught in courses on statecraft and secrecy. In the tight geography of CIA black sites places later revealed to include spots in Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and, according to later findings, sites in Poland and Romania. Waking someone became a strategic act. Imagine the steady beat of a light outside it, or the low tread of guards, the measured voice that will not let sleep return for hours then days. It was low-tech and intimate. It left no scar to stitch, no broken bone to trace. It left time as its canvas, and time is patient. The legal structure that tried to justify these practices was at its heart an exercise in word control. During autumn and winter, 2,000 lawyers in the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel began to write opinions later called the torture memos. Names like John U.J. by B. and Stephen Bradbury are inked in this history. They wrote in the cool, detached voice of lawyers. They defined torture narrowly. They argued only the most extreme, long physical pain could meet the legal bar, and they gave reasons, some constitutional, some practical, for why the president's wartime power and the executive's need to protect security allowed certain techniques. Sleep deprivation was discussed not as a grotesque new thing, but as a calibrated tool. A few days, maybe longer. In the memos, the measurement of time became must and enforce severity. These legal views were not lone thoughts, but architecture for action. The CIA, working within what it thought was a permissive legal frame, hired psychologists and former military trainers James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen among them, who drew from military survival training, Cold War behavior manuals, and improvisation. The result was a menu of enhanced interrogation techniques that mixed the bodily with the mental, forced standing stress positions for nudity, sensory manipulation, waterboarding. Sleep was singled out because it increases vulnerability in ways intimate and precise. Deny someone sleep and you disturb not only memory and focus but the sense of continuity. Time stops being linear, hallucinations grow in the gaps, decision-making breaks. The person who can no longer trust their memory is, from a questioner's view, more moldable. By winter 2000, the program had a secret choreography. Detainees were moved by CI-operated planes rendition flights that stitched a map of complicity across continents, from Pakistan to Afghan deserts to concrete rooms in Eastern Europe. Flight manifests later exposed in court and investigative reporting suggested a system so broad it could only have been kept up by bureaucratic networks and the quiet agreement of states that preferred deniability. It was not just the act of a few men in white rooms. It involved state players, contractors, intelligence officers, and legal advisors, who debated the lines until in some places the lines blurred completely. Public attention, however, is a stubborn force. It came in stages with different textures. In April 2000, photos from Abu Ghraib prison leaked to the world, images that made visible the humiliations of military detention in Iraq. Those photos were not all about sleep, but the same culture of allowed cruelty that let long wakefulness be treated as a technique. Also produced hooded prisoners, improvised stress positions, and humiliating displays. Abu Ghraib pictures seen around the globe pressed public outrage into a moment of clear horror. Yet the more secret program, black sites and enhanced questioning stayed hidden in classification, until investigative reporting and legal inquiries began to pry open the doors. Between 2004 and 2006, a slow steady stream of reveals, journalistic, legal and congressional, began to merge. Major newspapers and international outlets published accounts based on leaks and interviews. In 2005, it became public that the CI had destroyed videotapes of interrogations. 2 tapes reportedly showing early stages of Abu Zubaydah's questioning, and maybe others, were erased on orders that later drew heavy scrutiny and blame. The CIA director at the time, Michael Hayden, inherited a house of secrets and a reputation in pieces for having overseen methods many now saw as morally and legally wrong. The Justice Department's own internal checking and shifting legal advice complicated the story. After the 2002 memos into 2000 for Jack Goldsmith, who replaced some of those lawyers, concluded the Office of Legal Counsel had been too narrow in its torture definition and withdrew several opinions. Still, the memos had their effect and practices they made normal continued. The legal debate, is sleep deprivation torture? Does it meet the severe pain standard? Was less a neutral law question than a fight over meaning between political players with different appetites for risk. When photos or memos landed publicly, the liberal institutions that guard principle, human rights groups, civil liberties bodies, and some lawmakers began to demand accountability. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Red Cross insisted the United States broke the Convention Against Torture and customary international law. In capitals worldwide, diplomats were asked uncomfortable questions about complicity. Political reckoning was uneven. Some in the administration doubled down. Vice President Dick Cheney, among the strongest defenders of the program, argued in interviews the techniques were necessary and legal. He framed the debate as a choice between harshness and disaster. The executive branch claimed national security needs emphasizing secrecy to justify both the methods and the refusal to give details. Congress, limited by partisanship, held hearings that punctured public calm, but rarely achieved the unified action that might have brought wide prosecutions. A few military people and contractors were tried and convicted. Some low-level guards at Abu Ghraib, some contractors for specific abuses. But the most important figures were shielded. The Senate's Intelligence Committee opened its own inquiry with careful thoroughness, the result of years of subpoenas, redactions, and negotiated declassifications, was the 2014 report on the CIA's detention and interrogation program. Its 600-page version, of which a 525-page summary was finally released publicly. Read like a forensic biography of a secret regime, the report did not just list techniques. It argued the program was more brutal than the CIA had admitted, that it was less effective than supporters claimed, and that the agency had misled policymakers and the public about how well the techniques were, including sleep deprivation, at producing reliable intelligence. The report concluded the program's achievements were overstated and its successes were brittle. It found some high-value detainees were subjected to sleep deprivation for long times, sometimes in ways that neared sensory and cognitive breakdown. The release of the Senate report deepened the public reckoning, but did not bring universal justice. The Justice Department, under the Obama administration, considered and in some cases pursued prosecutions. Attorney General Eric Holder in 2009 said prosecutions would go ahead. Yet, in the end, political will proved partial. Several career prosecutors later explained privately and publicly that legal hurdles, the passage of time and worries about exposing classified methods, made criminal cases difficult. The result was a public record of embarrassment, a formal admission by a leading democracy that it had for a time allowed practices many called torture, coupled with a reluctance to pursue legal consequences fully, at least for top officials. This created a strange, lasting moral gap. Apologies and policy changes on one hand, impunity and unresolved blame on the other. Institution reflexes, however, shifted. President Barack Obama's executive order in January 2009 tried to close the cycle by banning enhanced interrogation techniques at CIA sites and requiring questioning practices consistent with the Army Field Manual. The order aimed to normalize interrogation within rules that in intention were transparent and humane. The CIA's detention program was officially ended. Black sites were supposed to be a memory, but reputational damage is slow to heal. Allies and foes alike learned a powerful nation could in secret craft legal memos that allowed the unthinkable. For many outside observers, law breaking by a democracy eroded acclaim. It had long made moral leadership. Those who survived the programs moved into quieter, longer fights. Medical care rake of legal redress and the fragile work of rebuilding a life. This is where policy history meets the intimate ground of human bodies and minds. Forced wake-up disrupts the nervous system in ways immediate and often lasting. In a lab, one night of sleep loss dulls attention fragments, memory clouds judgment. In a question room, used as policy, sleep deprivation becomes a cumulative assault. The first 24 hours leave marks on concentration. 48 hours bring microsleeps and dry motion. Beyond 72 hours, people face breakdowns, hallucinations, detached episodes, and erosion of time sense. When these practices are used deliberately and repeatedly, effects can be compounded by other techniques: stress positions, sensory loss, temperature change. Together they produce a syndrome injury to thinking, mood, and the body. Clinical literature supports what many survivors describe in story form: vivid nightmares, broken sleep, long-term insomnia, mood disorders, and a mental fog many call a permanent jet lag that never lifts. Psychiatry and neurology agree on several core findings. Sleep is not a luxury. It is a physical need for memory, fixing, emotion control, and metabolic balance. Interrupt that process deliberately, repeatedly, in a context of fear, humiliation, and steady stress, and you invite a host of illnesses. Post-traumatic stress disorder shows in recurring nightmares and broken sleep. But in questioning meant to deprive, the relationship becomes a loop. Severe sleep loss worsens hyperarousal and intrusive memory, which in turn blocks restorative sleep, a vicious circle. Long-term studies of people exposed to chronic sleep disruption, shift workers, medical residents, and tragically prisoners, show links to heart disease, blood sugar problems, and immune system issues. These are not just symbolic harms, they raise long-term death risks. Growing research links chronic sleep trouble with brain-wasting processes, including buildup of proteins tied to Alzheimer's, though cause paths are still studied. What is clear in survivors of forced wakefulness is that complaints often do not match visible injury. There is no easy crace, no scar, the wound is invisible and stubborn. That invisibility is part of the cruelty. Paths of survivors vary. Some with early access to full care sleep hygiene help trauma-focused therapy drug support when needed, regain a degree of stable function. Others face lasting cognitive trouble problems with steady attention, working memory, executive function. They struggle to hold stories together, to follow a conversation's flow others take for granted. They may show irritability impulsively or withdrawal. Other conditions often appear chronic pain, substance use, self-medication, suicidal thought. In the worst cases, the challenge for doctors is not just to treat symptoms, but to rebuild trust in sleep itself. Sleep becomes paradoxically a space of possible danger, where nightmares rush in underbody. That learned to fear dark must be slowly persuaded that rest will not be weaponized. Diagnosis here is complicated by overlapping symptom clusters and social doubt. There is a cultural tendency, especially in court settings, to disbelieve injuries without visible scars. The demand for hard proof hits badly against lived experience. Legal authorities ask for certainty tied to records, memos, tapes that often do not exist because secrecy and destruction were part of the strategy. This is not to say survivors are not believed at all. Rather, their stories live in a contested space. Forensic psychiatrists and neuropsychologists can give test batteries that show deficits consistent with sleep loss effect, but causes hard to prove conclusively, especially years later. Memory itself is fragile. Sleep loss distorts encoding. Memories may be broken, incomplete, or merged, yet patterns emerge when doctors put together histories, the timing of symptoms after detention, the match of multiple survivor accounts, and objective performance gaps on neuropsychological tests. Treatments are multidisciplinary and often long-term. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is one of the best non-drug interventions. It teaches behavioral and thinking strategies to re-anchor sleep. Trauma-focused psychotherapies address intrusive memories and hyperarousal that keep sleep fractured. Drug sleep aids for short-term stability, antidepressants for nightmares can play a role, but they risk dependency and are rarely enough alone. Social factors are key. Survivors often live with legal limbo, social stigma, economic instability. These worsen sleep problems. Recovery thus needs to be social and medical, public and private. It demands that systems, healthcare, legal, humanitarian work together, facing evidence that the harm does not show itself easily. This interplay between invisible harm and proof difficulty brings us to a third area, the hard, careful work of proving the unseen. Forensic proof in cases of sleep deprivation and coercive questioning is an art of assembly. No single piece of evidence is final. Instead, cases rely on linking documents, witness statements, medical exams, and sometimes willing reveals by officials. The kinds of support that have worked vary. Records from the time, detention logs, questioning schedules, medical notes are gold. They show the rhythm of a regime. Flight manifests and airline contracts show rendition routes. Expense accounts can show which countries hosted sites. Internal memos and legal opinions, once declassified or leaked, provide the word frame that let practices be seen as legal. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report was possible because of access to such records. Its findings carried weight because it gave documentary proof that backed survivors' stories. Yet limits are deep. Many key documents were blacked out or held back. Videotapes were destroyed, orders were spoken. The CIA's use of contractors further muddled accountability. Contractors work in a legal gray zone protected by layers of corporate screening. When investigative journalists and courts tried to trace blame, They pressed against classification claims of national security and the judicial habit of deference. In U.S. courts, the state secrets privilege has been used to block civil suits. Internationally, tools vary. The European Court of Human Rights has judged cases finding state guilt when states were complicit in hosting sites or helping renditions. Italy's courts famously tried and convicted CIA operatives in absentia for the 2003 kidnapping of Imam Abu Omar in Milan, a legal episode that showed how home courts could use ordinary criminal process to challenge extraordinary state secrecy. Forensic investigators often turn to the body for confirmation. Signs of sleep loss can be guessed from medical records that show sudden cognitive drop, delirium, or psychiatric symptoms soon after detention. Neurospecifical testing can document gaps matching long wakefulness, though these are not unique and can be argued to reflect other causes. Imaging studies MRI team show structural or functional oddities, yet the cause chain is debated. Sleep loss affects brain wave patterns. Certain patterns may be recorded, but only if tests are done close in time to the abuse years later the trail cools. Witnesses, both insiders and outsiders, matter greatly. Whistleblowers, CIA officers, military medical staff, interpreters give testimony that can pierce denials. The courage of people like John Kyrie, KOU, who revealed parts of the CIA's program, or military who reported abuses, gave threads investigative bodies could follow. The state can and often does hit back. Whistleblowers face career ruin, prosecution, and isolation. This dynamic is part of the cost of truth, seeking in systems that prefer secrecy to light. The legal burden of proof, especially in criminal cases, is exacting. Prosecutors must show both the act and the intent to inflict pain or severe suffering. When legal memos clutter the record, arguing about intent becomes a battle of interpretation. Did top officials truly approve a program meant to cause severe suffering? Or did they believe, however wrongly, they were acting within the law and for a greater good? These are questions not just of fact, but of political will. They are also questions of precedent. Prosecuting leaders for legal opinions, they proved risks, setting executive branch wartime powers in a way any courts and politicians hesitate to face. Political context shapes evidence outcomes. In the immediate post-9/11 thesc, climate fear gave moral permission. In later years, when publics no longer felt the immediacy of September 11, the appetite for investigations grew, but so did resistance to prosecutions that might expose classified sources and methods. International players gave different responses. Some European states started inquiries into their own complicity and rendition. Others quietly helped the CIA in exchange for intelligence. Human rights groups pushed for universal jurisdiction, for treaties to be enforced, for governance bodies to hold states accountable. Their success has been mixed. The struggle to turn moral clarity into legal result is costly and slow, yet legal strategies keep evolving. Civil lawsuits offer a path that avoids some criminal limits, though they often settle under secret deals and give money without public trials. European courts, less blocked by the US state secrets privilege, have given venues where victims have had some wins. Public inquiries and parliamentary investigations give another tool, less punitive perhaps, but valuable for making an official record. The Senate report in that sense was a fact-finding instrument more than payback. It recorded in a way future historians and policymakers will read the shape of transgression and the limits of legal reasoning. Forensic science itself is finding new paths. Sleep deprivation biomarkers are an emerging field. Molecular signs, neurological imbalances, patterns of brain connection disturbed by sleep loss may someday serve as more direct proof. At present, though they are linked and debated, memory science offers tools to understand how time and trauma reshape witness accounts, making testimony both more vulnerable and, in some patterns, more reliable. Chain of custody paperwork, careful logging, extra records, and times when classification is lifted for independent review can preserve evidence value. But none of these tools can fully replace political courage. History, in the soft shift of its later hours, tends to fold these episodes into stories of learning and forgetting. The public reckoning after post-9/11 thefts, enhanced questioning practices brought reform. Some last. The Obama administration's orders closed black sites and tried to tie questioning to a legal frame. The American Medical Association and psychiatric profession faced their ethical duties, finally taking stronger stands banning clinician help in torture and coercive questioning. Survival training lessons were examined and their misuse exposed. Yet, institutional memory is fickle. New threats, new tech, new administrations may redraw eyes. Legal memos can be written and rewritten. The fine print of policy can be made to swallow ethical bans when fear is sharp. The people who live these practices live in a slower time. Some regain the simple rhythm of night and day, others have not. Their stories complicate any neat moral map. Sleep deprivation as torture is a weapon that teaches us about cruelty as modernity. It is manageable and nonviolent because it leaves no scar. It asks us to invent legal and moral forms that can see the unseen. For survivors, the work of recovery is therapeutic and legal, medical and political. For states, the work is harder to build institutions that resist the temptation to weaponize a human fragility, even in the glare of fear. In the final judgment of history, perhaps the truest measure of this era will not be how many memos were written or blacked out, nor how many settlements were quietly paid, nor yet which prosecutions were clever. It will be whether democracies learned to guard not only their security, but also their humanity in moments of danger. The sleep taken from detainees was not an abstract policy test, but an attack on the continuity of the self. It crossed a line many nations had once vowed to keep sacred. The post-9/11 theft policies taught an old lesson new, that the soft, quiet things time and memory rest are among the first and strongest casualties when governments trade secrecy for speed and doctrine for thought. So the record becomes a patchwork of memos and redactions, images and denials, clinical notes and the whispered testimony of those kept awake until their minds frayed. Forensic practices will advance our ability to document. The physical traces of sleep loss will improve. Courts will keep wrestling with proof standards never made for harms without visible wounds. Meanwhile, clinicians will mend, as they can, the bodies and minds unstitched by long wakefulness, and advocates will press for legal fixes that stay stubborn in their hunt for truth. History has a long memory for certain ironies. The weapon that leaves no scars leaves, instead, a map of absence. The map is made of sleepless nights of memos that argued away oral lines, of destroyed tapes and flight manifests, once hidden in hangars at dusk. It is made of the hushed talks of lawyers who thought they could box moral danger in clauses, and of psychologists who turned training into technique. It is finally made of people who now must learn again to trust the night. We end for now with the patient work that follows revelation, documentation, therapy, legal fight, and the slow essential act bearing witness. Sleep deprivation as state practice taught the world what cruelty can look like when made administrative. The human cost, the medical results, and the forensic troubles of proving such harm are all part of a history still being written. In the soft, measured tone of memory and policy, that history insists on a question that will not be shelved by memos or classified stamps. What price of security should society be willing to pay for its soul? There is a certain quiet violence in how the law learns to name things, how international tools trace the shape of cruelty not by a wound's color, but by the form of a night without sleep. The story of how sleep denial, the slow erasure of eyelids, moved from the shadows of question cells into the formal language of ban, is clinical and stubborn, full of treaties and footnotes. Late night draft and morning meetings where diplomats picked careful verbs over heats of blame. Long before the word enhanced was given two methods designed to leave no blood, states had already put a few principles on paper. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights said in calm sentences, "No one should be tortured. the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights adopted in 1966, in force by 1976, repeated that ban in binding legal tow. These texts did not speak in the detail of question manuals, but they laid a moral pavement on which later law would try to walk without tripping. The United Nations Convention Against Torture, adopted in 1980 for in force in 1987, is the keystone for modern international bans. It binds states to prevent torture and punish it. Its Article 1 defines torture in a way that goes beyond broken bones. It speaks of intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, for purposes like getting information, punishment, intimidation or coercion, when done by or with the okay of public officials. That phrase, whether physical or mental, matters. It is the legal hinge that opens the door to seeing that a man or woman kept awake, kept disoriented, systematically denied the rhythms that bind our minds, may suffer a depth of injury not visible on an autopsy table, but law rests on interpretation. For decades, regional human rights bodies and courts were pressed to say whether certain no-touch techniques counted as torture. One of the first clear tests came in Strasbourg in 1978, when the European Court of Human Rights decided Ireland versus the United Kingdom. The case looked at the 5 techniques used on internees in Northern Ireland in 1971-72: wall standing, hooding, subjection to noise, deprivation of sleep and food, and long isolation. The court concluded painfully and provocatively that these methods were not torture, but amounted to inhuman and degrading treatment. The decision set a legal precedent, narrow contested and one cited again and again, that the line between torture and inhuman treatment could rest partly on a judgment of intensity and duration. The judgment had results beyond Britain and Ireland. It was a note in a larger song about what states might do in the name of security, without breaking the criminal bar, and how courts might be asked to judge what to ordinary moral sense feels like the same thing. Regional law and United Nations mechanisms did not, however, agree on a single scene. The Inter-American system and national courts in Latin America began to face the massive use of sleep in oil and sensory manipulation. Under military dictatorships in the 1970s and 1980s, truth commissions in Argentina, Chile and Uruguay recorded testimony about questioners who engineered cruelty through patterns of deprivation. Long shifts of questioning, sudden light and dark, constant questioning against loud grinding noise. National prosecutions slowly followed in those countries as dictators fell and archives opened. The Indian Supreme Court, the South African Constitutional Court, European tribunals, and special UN committees all added distinct threads to the tapestry, sometimes drawing tighter lines around severe mental suffering, at other times leaving generous room for state choice under the label of national security. After September 11, 2000, when the legal debates became urgent and public in a new way, the Bush administration, eager to prevent more attacks, reached for a word that would make certain techniques legal necessity. A small group of lawyers in the U.S. Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel, including John U. Unjay, wrote memos in 2002 and 2003 that argued for a narrow definition of torture, one that needed physical pain like organ failure or death, and thus cleared the way for enhanced interrogation techniques. In U.S. detention sites and secret CIA allocations, those memos were not just dry legal arguments, they were the hinge on which policy swung. When the CIA wanted legal cover for techniques like long sleep deprivation, the memos gave carefully worded definitions and mental math that made the endless seem in the eyes of lawyers legally defensible. Outside Washington, other legal voices cried foul. International human rights experts, the UN Committee Against Torture, and a chorus of human rights groups insisted that a narrow literal definition of torture would undermine the very purpose of the ban. In 2003 and 2000, for the International Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch, published reports alleging the U.S. program in Guantanamo Bay and secret black sites used techniques that cause severe mental and physical suffering, sleep denial, long shackling, stress positions, exposure to cold, and heavy reliance on threats and humiliation. The UN Human Rights System and later the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture issued repeated statements that sleep deprivation and sensory overload could meet the bar for torture when systematic, long and purposefully used to get information. One striking rhythm in the law is the tug-of-war between universal principles and tailored exceptions. The key treaties demand prohibition, national security reasoning woven into state practice, crafts exemptions or narrow readings. Court and committee decisions sometimes tried to measure suffering by duration and intensity. That math has practical results. A detainee kept awake 48 hours might be called ill-treated, but a lawyer might argue not torture. At Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, the practical result was many of the most important decision makers escaped criminal charge. U.S. questioners and legal advisors who designed and approved programs were rarely brought to court, while a handful of low-ranking military people paid with prison time for obvious abuse. The law, neutral in statute and human, in practice often bends toward the institutional center of power, where secrets are shielded by national security. The bar to accountability rises. Around the same time, Europe began to inquire more aggressively into its own complicity. The Council of Europe commissioned a 2006 report by Swiss prosecutor Dick Marty that documented secret detentions and renditions across the continent, naming specific countries, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, as hosting facilities, where detainees were kept and moved, oft unquestioned by foreign services. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe published findings that year that led to investigations on national inquiries. In Strasbourg, victims of rendition and abuse began to bring cases, such as El Mosri seized in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. In 2012, the European Court of Human Rights found that Mr. El Mosri, who had been kidnapped by CIA agents and held in Macedonia before rendition to Afghanistan, had suffered grave rights violations, a decision that underlined the power of regional courts to impose responsibility, even when national security arguments were used. Yet every turn gaps remained between law in books and law in practice. Secrecy is the stubborn companion of techniques that leave no scars. Classified programs are designed partly to avoid the witness of a public record. Investigators are blocked by diplomatic privilege, evidence is destroyed, and states claim revealing the methods would harm intelligence, sources and operations, where international watch bodies might ask for access. The Committee Against Torture, or the UN Special Rapporteur, states and a lay limit or deny. Remedies exist on paper. On the ground, they are often out of reach. Without political will, whistleblowers, or the mechanical force of leaked documents and photos, which brings us inevitably to the long restless work of exposure. The kind of slow burn reveal that changes public talk, forces committees to open files and pushes courts to take fitful steps toward accountability. The story of how sleep deprivation became unfashionable legally and politically is also a story of people who would not or could not keep the secret. Investigative journalism has been the chisel that chips at official stone. The images of Abu Ghraib faces, hooded bodies stacked in version of dignity, caught in a handful of photos, were not a public relations accident. They were the result of a soldier, Joseph Darby, who in 2004 handed photos and information to a chain of command that reached journalists and the public. Seymour Hersh wrote the first major exposing newspapers and magazines worldwide followed. The photos shocked. They did more than shock. They created story anchors around which more investigations gathered. Journalists like Jane Mayer in The New Yorker traced the policy line, from legal memos through to contracted jobs and the structure of secret sites. Investigative teams in Europe and North America, working with human rights groups, began to pull threads that led from CIA black sites to diplomatic clearances in European capitals. Leakers and whistleblowers turn knowledge stored in servers and binders into public fact. In the U.S., John Kerry, a KOUSC officer, went public in 2007, calling waterboarding a questioning technique used on a specific suspect. He argued it was torture. The act of naming put Kerry AKOU against his agency and the law. He was later prosecuted on unrelated charges. Chelsea Manning, a name that would dominate public debate about secrecy, released a trove of documents to WikiLeaks in 2010, opening windows into the conduct of war and detention that scholars, journalists, and prosecutors would later examine. The Senate Intelligence Committee study of the CIA's detention program, done in 2012 and released in classified summary form in December 2014, under Senator Dianne Feinstein, was possible because of access to internal CIA materials and interviewed. It was a catalogue written in the plain voice of investigators. The CIA's program did not produce reliable intelligence. It involved harsh techniques, including long sleep deprivation, and it left an indelible moral stain. Non-governmental groups, the patient archivists of abuse, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Physicians for Human Rights gathered testimony, documented scars both visible and invisible, and pressed courts and parliaments for inquiry. The reports, often meticulous and footnote and date, drew lines from practices in 1972's Latin American dictatorships to modern versions in the War on Terror era. They filed friend of the court briefs. They submitted shallow reports to UN committees. Their work turned detainee experiences into legal arguments and public stories that courts, media, and legislatures could not easily ignore. Sometimes disclosure comes as a memo leak. The Bybee Memo and other Office of Legal Counsel texts, once secret, were pulled into the light and read aloud in hearings and newspapers. The literal language of lawyer sentences that asked if the pain standard needed organ failure or death became fuel for outrage. Once a phrase enters the public vocabulary, it reshapes talk. Enhanced interrogation became a contested soft word. Illegal under international law became an accusation that echoed in parliaments and streets. Disclosure can prompt institutional inquiries. The U.S. Congress held hearings, commissioned reports, and debated whether to criminally investigate architects of questioning policy. In Europe, parliaments examined possible complicity in renditions. In Italy, the case of the Milan kidnapping of Imam Mustafa Salman, also known as Abu Ammar, in 2003, led to an Italian investigation and finally to convictions and absentia for several CIA operatives in 2009. The European Parliament's interrogation inquiry and the Council of Europe's work laid public sight lines on networks of complicity otherwise hard to see. Yet leaks and investigations do more than open files. They change the frame of what is politically possible. When photos and memos become public, political players cannot easily keep the same tone. They must answer, even if half-heartedly. The Obama administration cancelled the harshest legal opinion and issued executive orders to end CIA black site detention. Executive Order 13,491 in January 2009 called for closing secret detention sites and stressed lawful interrogations, though critics would later argue some practices continued in changed form, and that the policy end did not clear the slate of moral blame. Public disclosure puts pressure on institutions. Military courts tried a handful of Abu Ghraib perpetrators. The Senate released a scathing report and human rights groups pushed for reparations and reforms. Yet disclosure rarely solves problems fully. Truth is needed, but not enough for justice. There is another group of actors who work in the tense moral spaces between diagnosis and deceit. Health professionals. Their ethical codes, forged in the bitter light of history, sometimes clash with state practices, in ways almost theatrical in their irony. The medical profession carries the legacy of its betrayals. In Nazi Germany, doctors oversaw deadly experiments and euthanasia programs. The Nuremberg doctors' trial exposed medicine's twisted role in state violence and gave birth to the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles meant to protect human dignity in research. Those aftershocks shaped later, more specific bans about taking part in torture. In 1975, the World Medical Association adopted the Declaration of Tokyo, a clear statement forbidding doctors from taking part in or being present during interrogations, aimed at getting confessions as well as from any acts that could be considered torture. The declaration said a doctor's duty is first and foremost to the patient. That language, first and foremost, creates a moral bind against double loyalty, where a doctor's duty to the state conflicts with duty to the person before them. Later tools like the Istanbul Protocol of 1999 gave practical guidance to health professionals on documenting torture and treating survivors, anchoring clinical observation in medical legal procedure. Despite these principles, the post-9/11 FES era saw troubling patterns of medical involvement. At Guantanamo and in CIA programs, military and contracted psychologists and doctors were sometimes placed at the crossroads of care and coercion. The CIA's use of hired psychologists, most notably James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, is a particularly sharp example. These psychologists were contracted to develop and advise on what would be called enhanced interrogation techniques. Their involvement blurred the line between clinical knowledge used to heal and clinical knowledge used to harm. Critics argued their training in behavior change and resilience was repurposed into a toolkit for breaking detainee resistance. The result was a public debate about whether a professional trusted with mental health skill could ethically design methods meant to cause psychological breakdown. The American Psychological Association faced one of the fiercest reckonings. For years, the AP's relationship with the Defense Department and CIA had left unclear whether psychologists could be present at interrogations. In 2015, an independent review widely called the Hoffman Report found that some API officials had worked with the Defense Department to make policies that let psychologists be involved in interrogations, and that the group had failed to protect its ethical standards. The scandal brought resignations, public apologies, and an overhaul of policy, but it also showed how professional groups can be co-opted by national security priorities, and how safety guards can vanish under political pressure. Doctors to have been implicated in troubling ways. Military doctors who serve in detention settings face daily hard choices. They are tasked with caring for detainees, but they may also be asked to say, a detainee is fit for questioning, for solitary confinement, or even for force feeding during hunger strikes. The World Medical Association and national medical groups have insisted doctors must not take part in torture or ill treatment, and that watching interrogations in a participatory way is unethical. Yet the reality inside detention centers is messier. Reports from Guantanamo and Bagram alleged that medical staff watched detainees during questioning, noted vulnerabilities, and advised questioners when a detainee could be pushed further. Where records were later checked in lawsuits, these notes became proof of complicity. The ethical argument is sharp in its clarity. For a doctor to use knowledge of body or mind to make harm more effective is to betray the core oath. But practical pressures can be huge. Military doctors work in a chain of command. They may get orders. They may fear payback for saying no. Some refused, others complied, perhaps reasoning their presence reduced harm or that they were preventing outright death. Alberto Mora, then General Counsel of the Navy, is one named figure who resisted. He lobbied inside the Defense Department, pushed for clarity and restraint, becoming a quiet counterweight to more permissive lawyers and policymakers. There are also professional responses that try to rebuild the fences. The World Medical Association updated guidance and launched campaigns to reinforce that force-feeding combat in hunger strikers is wrong when done to break protest. The Declaration of Malta gave clear standards for doctors faced with hunger-striking detainees. Physicians for Human Rights compiled witness accounts and clinical notes, giving expert testimony on the mental and physical impact. of long sleep deprivation, and other no-touch techniques. These bridges between clinical observation and legal fix become key in courts and truth commission. Clinical testimony can turn a sleepless vigil into a legal story about intentional infliction of severe suffering, but accountability stays partial. Few health professionals have been criminally prosecuted for roles in interrogation program. Some faced professional censure, others just retired. The reasons are familiar: secrecy, the political difficulty of prosecuting those who acted under approval, the trouble of proving intent when policymakers said they relied on legal advice. The result is an uneasy balance, where ethical codes are stronger on paper while practice adapts to new shapes of secrecy and contract insulation. Psychologists who took government contracts often worked under non-disclosure pacts and private consultant structures that isolated them from peer review and oversight. It is a lesson bitterly learned that codes alone are not enough. Without enforcement and without a culture that values professional integrity over institutional convenience, the dilemmas of consent and treatment also echo in the clinics that treat survivors, mental health pros who see returnees, those released from secret detention or ex-detainees reintegrating into communities, face the challenge of diagnosing harm that bears no visible scars. Sleep deprivation, when long unsystematic, causes neurobiologic changes, broken attention, intrusive memories, mood instability, and, in some cases, psychosis. Doctors call these conditions by clinical names. Survivors call them by the ordinary language of broken nights. Documentation under the Istanbul Protocol becomes a clinical choreography. Careful notes, timelines linking interrogations with symptoms. Those documents then enter legal processes, reparations, talks, asylum checks, and historical archives. There are, amid the gloom, moments of reform worth naming. The public reveals and investigations of the early 2000s prompted law and policy shifts. The United States passed the Detainee Treatment Act in 2005, trying to set limits on treatment and forbid cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, weighed in with decisions like Russell v. Bush, 2000, forgiving Guantanamo detainees access to U.S. courts, and Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, 2006, which cut back some executive excesses. International bodies issued findings. The UN Special Reporter on Torture, notably Juan Mendez, condemned long solitary confinement and shaped debate with crisp statements, saying deprivation of sleep, when combined with other techniques and applied heavily, could be torture. These statements fed a slow turn among some states toward stricter limits, and yet practices adapt when a technique finds itself legally or politically risky. Practitioners often look for next-generation methods that fit the shape of ban while seeking the same strategic ends. For every legal advance, there is a parallel search for believable denial, for soft words, for contract buffers, for rebranding practices and training manuals that avoid blunt labels. The result is a lasting contest between norm law, the standards and duties sovereigns claim to accept, and the practical wants of security institutions that, when stressed, will test those norms' limits. A history of sleep deprivation as a tool that rise its public exposure, its partial legal containment, and its ethical unraveling. Thus reads, as a compact lesson in human ingenuity, both for harm and for restraint. It is a lesson about the fragility of safeguards when the state rallies against a seen existential threat, about the stubborn courage of those who leak and those who document, and about the weary necessary work of the professions meant to heal. When sleep is weaponized, it is not just the body that is attacked, but the grammar of trust that makes society possible. Trust in institutions and caretakers, and in the rules that separate war from atrocity. If law gives the vocabulary for condemnation, whistleblowers and journalists give the public the punctuation mark. And if doctors and psychologists hold the keys to healing, their ethics and the will to hold them to those ethics decide whether the keys are used to mend or to magnify harm. All three pieces are needed to make the ban on sleep deprivation interrogation more than a line in a treaty. They make it a working norm, enforceable and culturally rooted. Consider in this slow story the cost of silence. When a single memo's slippery grammar becomes the roof under which a program grows. Secrecy protects the architects for a time. When photos are hidden in a desk drawer the public sleeps on. When a doctor signs a form saying fitness for questioning a moral deal is struck that echoes. The exposure of those deals, whether through the brave act of a soldier handing over photos, the careful records compiled by an NGO, or the shaky testimony of a survivor, breaks the complicity of silence. It drives inquiries and sometimes prosecutions, and sometimes reforms deeper than laws alone can achieve. And yet the law itself stays an imperfect lantern in a dark room. Tools like the UN Convention Against Torture give a legal frame. Regional courts and human rights bodies add interpretation and force. Special reporters and committees give guidance and judgment. But enforcement, the most painstaking of tasks, still depends on states' willingness to look inward and on the persistence of outsiders determined to bring light. The linking roles of disclosure, investigation, and professional ethics are what turn norms into living practice. There are also unexpected aftershocks. Former interrogation techniques become the subject of scholarship and art of memoir and court filings. And in each area, the same question returns: how did we let this happen? Mohamedou would SLA hire Mauritanian imprisoned at Guantanamo from 2000 to until 2016. Detailed his experience of sleep deprivation and other methods in a memoir, Guantanamo Diary, published in 2015. His words, painstaking and undramatic, joined legal reports and photo proof to stitch a fuller record. The public read it not just as proof of cruelty, but as testimony to endurance. In courts and parliaments, such testimonies can become rehabilitating forces for victims, for law, and for history. The story of ban exposure and professional duty continues as an unfinished talk. New international tools are drafted, new cases filed, new ethics policies adopted. But the basic dynamics remain. Where secrecy and executive fiat grow, where legal definitions are narrowed by self-interest, and where professionals are co-opted, the risk of return to cruelty increases. Conversely, where transparency, accountability, and ethical integrity are strong, the practice of inflicting sleep deprivation for questioning withers. To lie awake is in its private sense of vulnerability. To be kept awake by an other's design is to be reduced to a tool for someone else's ends. International law saw this and claims mental suffering can be as severe as physical suffering. Investigative reporters and whistleblowers taught the public to see the architecture behind those sleepless nights. Medical pros were reminded, sometimes painfully, that their sworn duty to heal cannot be outsourced to security reasons. The arc of this history is not a straight line toward neat closure. It is a line of encounters, of skirmishes, and of possible reforms. It is also quietly an ethic of attention. Attention to the small signs, to the quiet leaks, to the testimony of one who could not sleep. And when at last we return the light of history to the place where secrecy once ruled, we find more than evidence of past wrongs. We find in the total weight of law, journalism, and professional standard a new grammar for resisting those techniques that leave no visible marks. The grammar is not only legal, it is humane. It insists that even when the body bears no scar, the mind's wounds must be seen, aimed, and counted. It insists that pros refuse to turn their skill into tools of harm, and that societies be willing finally to accept the discomfort of public scrutiny. So the narrative folds in on itself. Treaties written in Geneva, Strasbourg courts, and Cape Town tribunals. The slow, courageous shape of whistleblower testimony. The careful documentation of NGOs and medical examiners. These together create a pressure that over time shifts policy. Sleep deprivation stays a tool in some arsenals. Laws and norms do not make cruelty vanish overnight, but the history shows us the mechanics of change. It shows how language was sharpened, how photos and memos forced inquiries, how doctors were drawn into an ethical second reckoning. It shows that where legal definitions grow to include mental suffering, where investigative light finds hidden rooms, and where professional codes are enforced not just stated, the use of methods designed to leave no scars becomes harder, and the moral bank account of states is at last debited for its breaches. In the somber hush that follows such reckoning one hears the faint, persistent sound of policy being rewritten, and of institutions grappling in small and large ways with their own shadows. The work is never finished. History will keep a slow ledger of memos issued and cancelled, of reports released and suppressed, of doctors who refused and doctors who obeyed, of soldiers who photographed and soldiers who followed orders. This ledger is the raw material for love or memory and for conscience. It tells a single piercing truth, that when sleep is made a weapon, it is the steady practice of law, the courage of truth tellers and the moral backbone of professionals, that together offer the best defenses against cruelty that leaves no scars.